The first thing I saw when I turned into my driveway was a 40-foot gap in my stone wall. Not a crack. Not a loose section. A gap. 22 limestone blocks were scattered across my side yard. The soil behind them had spilled into my flower bed, and a yellow skid steer sat idling beside my neighbor's new patio extension. At the center of the damage, half covered in dirt and crushed gravel, was a rusted metal survey pin I had never seen before. My neighbor, Blaine, had just knocked down my retaining wall while trying to build a wider parking pad for his camper. Then he looked at the exposed survey pin, smiled, and said, "Well, I looks like that wall was probably on my land anyway." He thought the broken wall would give him an excuse to take another 5 feet of my yard. What it actually gave me was the evidence that his patio, his drainage trench, and part of his new parking pad had been sitting on my property for nearly 9 months. And by the time the county finished reviewing the work, Blaine had to remove more than he destroyed. If you enjoy HOA stories, where property records, surveys, and patience hit harder than an argument, subscribe to HOA Reality Stories. And let me ask you this. If your neighbor destroyed a wall and then claimed your land belonged to them, what would you check first? The old survey, the deed, or the permit file? My name is Marcus Hale. I had lived on Willow Creek Court for 11 years, long enough to know where the ground shifted after a hard rain, which neighbors kept spare keys for each other, and exactly how much work went into maintaining a house built on a sloped lot. My property sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood with an HOA. The homes were not packed together, but the lots were smaller than they looked. Each backyard stepped down toward a common greenbelt, and most of the homes had retaining walls somewhere along the rear or side boundary. Those walls were not decorative. They held soil in place. They managed water flow, and in a few cases, including mine, they marked the line between two lots that had been graded long before either homeowner moved in. My wall ran along the right side of my backyard, beginning near the rear corner of my garage and continuing almost 60 feet toward the greenbelt. It was made of stacked limestone blocks, each one heavy enough that 2 grown men would struggle to lift it. Behind the wall was a gravel drainage layer and a perforated pipe that directed runoff safely toward a catch basin near the back of my lot. The wall was there when I bought the house, but I had maintained it carefully. 7 years earlier, after a heavy storm washed soil through one section, I hired a masonry contractor to rebuild the top course, install better drainage fabric, and reinforce the base. It cost me $8. Sube. That was not money I spent because I wanted a prettier yard. I spent it because the wall protected my foundation, my side garden, and the lower portion of my driveway. For years, it did its job quietly. Then Blaine moved in next door. Blaine bought the house to my right, about 2 years before this happened. He was 48, ran a small online resale business from home, and had the kind of confidence that made every ordinary project sound like a major investment opportunity. The first time we met, he told me he planned to maximize the land. I did not know what that meant at the time. I found out slowly. First, he removed an old shed and built a larger one near the back of his lot. Then he replaced his narrow deck with a covered patio. Then he bought a 32-foot camper and realized his driveway was not wide enough to park it comfortably. That was when he started looking at the space between our houses. The area beside his home was only 12 feet wide at its narrowest point. My stone wall sat lower than his yard by about 3 feet, creating a level change that made the lots look farther apart than they actually were. Blaine saw that strip and apparently decided it was wasted space. One Saturday morning, he walked over while I was trimming hedges. "I'm thinking about widening my side pad," he said. "For the camper?" "For the camper. The boat trailer. Maybe a work trailer later. I'm tired of juggling everything around." I looked toward the narrow strip beside his house. "You've got enough room for that?" "I can make room." I asked what he meant. He pointed toward the section near my wall. "If I level that edge and extend the pavers, I can get another 6 feet. I stopped trimming. "You mean on your side?" "Obviously. That wall is close to the property line." "Close isn't the same as on it." "No. But you should have someone confirm it before you start digging." Blaine gave me a dismissive little smile. "Marcus, I'm not building a skyscraper. I'm putting in pavers." "I'm telling you because the wall handles drainage for both lots?" "It handles drainage for your lot. The pipe runs along that wall. If you excavate beside it or cover the outlet, runoff has nowhere to go." He shrugged. "My contractor knows what he's doing." That was the first warning sign. Not the project itself. People are allowed to improve their property. The warning sign was the way Blaine said contractor like it erased the need for plans, property lines, permits, or basic caution. A week later, a crew arrived with a compact excavator, a skid steer, and 2 pallets of pavers. They worked for 3 days. I watched from my kitchen window as they removed part of Blaine's side lawn and widened the gravel base beside his driveway. They installed a raised paver area near the front of his property, and then extended it toward the backyard in a long rectangular strip. I did not see them cross the visible edge of the lots. I did not see them touch my wall, and I had no reason to stand over them with a measuring tape. Blaine had a contractor. The HOA had approved his exterior improvement request. I assumed the permit issue had been handled if one was required. That assumption was generous. It was also wrong. For the next several months, Blaine parked his camper on the new pad. Then he added a trailer. Then he began using the space for stacks of boxed merchandise he planned to resell online. The area looked crowded, but it was his property. Or at least, that was what I thought. The first real problem happened during a heavy rainstorm in early spring. Water began pooling along the right edge of my side yard, right above the wall. I had never seen it collect there before. Usually, the drainage pipe behind the limestone carried runoff downhill toward the catch basin. This time, water stood in the grass for nearly 2 days. I walked along the wall and noticed something strange. The small drainage outlet near Blaine's paver extension had been covered with gravel and landscaping fabric. It was not fully blocked, but the opening had been reduced to a narrow slit. I took photographs. Then I went next door. Blaine was unloading supplies from the camper. "Your paver work may be blocking the wall drainage outlet," I said. He looked where I pointed. "That little pipe? It carries runoff from behind the wall. It's probably clogged because it's old. It was flowing before your project." Blaine squatted beside the gravel edge and pressed his hand into the wet soil. "I don't see a problem. There is water backing up behind the wall. Then clean your pipe. I need you to make sure your landscaping does not cover it." He stood up. "Marcus, you're getting worked up over a drain. I'm asking you to keep the outlet clear." "Fine. I'll have somebody look at it." I thanked him and went home. Nobody looked at it. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. The water eventually drained, but the ground behind my wall remained soft longer than normal. I considered hiring a contractor immediately, but I knew what the first question would be. Was the blockage on my side or his? Without a survey or an excavation, I could not answer that. And I was not about to send workers onto Blaine's property based on a guess. So I continued documenting the drainage conditions, took photographs after rain, and hoped he would deal with the issue before it became serious. He didn't. By summer, Blaine had bought a second trailer. He had also started talking about putting a covered canopy beside the camper, something wide enough to shield the vehicle and create storage space underneath. That was when the HOA sent him a notice. I knew because he came over angry one evening, carrying a letter. They're saying I need approval for a canopy. He said. You probably do? It's my yard. It's still an HOA neighborhood. They approve the pavers. Then submit a plan for the canopy. He looked at me closely. You complain about me? No. You sure? Yes. Because this letter mentions drainage and setbacks. I shook my head. I did not contact the HOA. That was true. At that point, I had kept everything between us. I had not reported him. I had not contacted the county. I had not complained to other neighbors. I had only asked him to clear a drain. Blaine folded the letter. Well, somebody's watching. Then he walked away. After that, the atmosphere changed. He stopped waving. He parked the camper closer to the line between our houses. And every time I worked in my yard, I had the sense he was watching to see whether I was measuring something. I did not want to feud with the man next door. I wanted the drainage outlet cleared. That was all. But in late August, I came home from visiting my sister for the weekend and found a stack of fresh gravel piled directly beside the upper edge of my wall. Not on my lawn. Not obviously across the line. But close enough that I knew Blaine was preparing for something. The following Monday, I saw his contractor again. His name was Trent Maddox. And he had done the original paver work. I walked over while he was unloading equipment. Are you doing more work here? I asked. Blaine wants to widen the pad by a few feet and bring it level near the back. Is that going to affect the retaining wall? Trent looked toward it. We're not touching your wall. The drainage pipe is behind it. I'll tell him. Please do. And can you confirm where the property line is before any excavation starts? Trent paused. That's between you and Blaine. I'm asking because I do not want equipment crossing the line. He gave a polite nod. Understood. I should have pushed harder. I should have demanded a survey before they started, but I believed that saying it clearly was enough. I believed a contractor would not put machinery near a retaining wall without checking the plans. And I believed Blaine, whatever else he was, would not intentionally damage something that protected both our properties. Again, I gave him more credit than he deserved. The work started on a Thursday morning. At 7:05, the excavator was already scraping along the edge of Blaine's new paver pad. 8:00. A skid steer was moving gravel toward the rear of his lot. I worked from home that day, so I could hear the machines through the walls. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, at 9:40, I heard a sharp crack. Not a small construction noise. A deep, heavy impact that shook the glass in my office window. I looked outside and saw dust rising above the top of my stone wall. Then I heard another sound. Stone hitting stone. I ran outside. By the time I reached the side yard, the skid steer had backed away from the wall. Its bucket was raised. A chain was hanging from one corner. The center section of my limestone wall had collapsed outward into my flower bed. Dirt poured through the opening. The drainage fabric was torn. And near the base of the exposed soil, just beyond the broken stones, a rusted iron pin stood out of the earth at an angle. Blaine was standing beside Trent. Neither one of them looked surprised enough. What happened? I asked. Trent pointed toward the wall. The ground gave way. The ground didn't give way. I said, your skid steer hit the wall. Blaine stepped forward. We were clearing the edge. The wall just started falling. Your machine has a chain attached to the bucket. For moving some blocks? Those are my blocks. Blaine looked down at the rubble. That wall might be on my property. Marcus. I stared at him. What? He pointed at the rusted survey pin. Look where that marker is. It's on my side of the wall. It's exposed because your crew knocked the wall down. Maybe it was buried because the wall was built over the line. Trent said nothing. That told me he knew the conversation had gone somewhere dangerous. I knelt beside the broken stones without touching the pin. It was old, square, rusted, and partly bent. There was no cap, no visible number, nothing that told me whether it marked the actual corner, an old construction point, or something else entirely. But Blaine was already acting like he had won an argument. I knew that wall looked too far over. He said, "You have never said that before." I didn't need to. I could see it. "You could see a property line through a retaining wall?" He shrugged. "My grandfather worked in land development. You learn things." That was Blaine's favorite kind of statement. Not a fact. Not a document. Just a vague connection to somebody else's experience, offered like it was a legal opinion. I stood up. "No one touches anything else?" Trent looked relieved. "That's probably best." Blaine's face tightened. "You can't tell my contractor to stop working on my yard. I can tell him not to touch my wall, my drainage system, or anything near this exposed marker until a licensed surveyor determines where the boundary is." "You're overreacting. You knocked down 22 limestone blocks, and I said I'd fix it." "With what? The same contractor who hit it?" Trent looked at Blaine. "Maybe we should pause until the line gets checked." Blaine turned toward him. "You're letting him dictate your job now?" "I'm not dictating anything," I said. "I'm preserving evidence." That word changed the room. Blaine's eyes narrowed. "Evidence of what?" I pointed toward the wall. The broken drainage fabric, the exposed pin, and the paver extension only a few feet away, of where everything was before more dirt gets moved. He stepped closer. "You think I stole your land?" "I think a surveyor needs to answer that." He smiled. But it was the kind of smile people use when they are trying to make somebody feel foolish. "Go ahead," he said. "Spend your money." "I will. Because when that survey comes back and shows that wall was built on my side, I'm not paying for a single stone." I looked at him. "Then we'll have an answer." He pointed at the collapsed wall. "And you'll need to move the rest of it." That was the moment I realized this was not about repairing damage. Blaine did not want the wall fixed. He wanted the wall declared his problem only long enough to remove it, level the soil, and make his parking area even wider. He had seen an exposed marker and decided it could become a weapon. What he did not know was that I had spent 11 years saving every file connected to my house. The original site plan, the drainage drawings, the old title survey, the contractor invoice from the wall repair, and a folder from the day I bought the property that contained one document I had never needed to open until then. A survey map recorded before either of our houses had been built. I went inside, closed the door, and pulled out the folder. By the time I found it, I already knew one thing. I was not going to argue with Blaine about where he thought the line should be. I was going to find out exactly where it had always been. The folder was thicker than I remembered. I kept it in a fireproof box with the deed, homeowner's insurance papers, tax records, and every major repair invoice from the past decade. Most of it was ordinary paperwork, closing disclosures, appliance warranties, old paint receipts. But near the bottom was a folded survey map from 2003, when the neighborhood had first been subdivided. I spread it across my dining room table. The map showed both lots before the houses had been built. It included the drainage swale, the easements, the rear greenbelt, and the side boundary separating my property from Blaine's. There was one notation beside the boundary that caught my attention immediately. Set rebar with cap lot corner. I looked at the distance measurements. Then I looked through the window toward the broken wall. The old survey did not prove the rusted pin was the actual corner marker. Only a licensed surveyor could do that. But it showed something important. The line was not supposed to run where Blaine believed it ran. Based on the measurements, the boundary should have been closer to the outer edge of his paver extension, not several feet beyond my wall. I checked the site plan from my wall repair 7 years earlier. The masonry contractor had included a simple sketch with the invoice. It showed the wall positioned just inside my property, with the drainage pipe running behind it and an 18-inch maintenance strip between the wall and the boundary line. At the time, I had not cared much about the sketch. The crew had not been doing a property survey. They were rebuilding an existing wall in the same place. Now that little drawing mattered. If the wall had been built inside my property line, as the sketch suggested, then Blaine's pavers might have crossed the boundary long before his skid steer ever touched the stone. I called a licensed land surveyor that afternoon. The company was called Parker Land and Boundary. A woman named Renee answered. I explained that my neighbor's contractor had damaged a retaining wall and exposed an old metal pin near what might be the lot line. She asked the questions I expected. Did I have a recent survey? No. Did I have the recorded plat or any older drawings? Yes. Was there active work near the boundary? Yes. Was there a dispute over ownership or potential encroachment? Yes, I said. And the contractor is still there? Renee told me the earliest field appointment would be in 6 business days. That felt slow, but it was realistic. Surveyors did not appear an hour after a homeowner called, especially in late summer when half the county seemed to be building additions, pools, sheds, and new driveways. She explained that they would locate any existing monumentation, compare it with the recorded plat, measure from established control points, and prepare a boundary survey if the evidence supported it. She also gave me advice I appreciated. Do not rely on the exposed pin until it is verified, she said. It may be a property monument. It may be an old construction stake. It may have been moved over time. Photograph it. Protect the area from disturbance. And do not let anyone remove it. I won't. Also, if the wall has collapsed and there's an active drainage concern, you may need a contractor to stabilize the area. Just make sure they document conditions before they move material. I thanked her and booked the appointment. Then I went back outside. Trent had turned off the skid steer. His equipment was parked near Blaine's garage. Blaine was standing in his driveway with his phone in his hand. I hired a surveyor. I told him. He laughed. Good for you. They'll be here next week. Until then, nobody moves the wall debris, the exposed pin, or the soil around it. You don't get to shut down my project. I am not shutting down your project. I am telling you that you do not have permission to work near the damaged wall or the disputed boundary. You think you can stop me with a phone call? No, I think I can stop you with a survey. That made his expression go cold. He stepped closer to the edge of his driveway. You've been looking for an excuse to mess with me since I moved in. I asked you to keep a drainage outlet clear. You've been checking my pavers. You've been taking pictures. I started taking pictures when water started backing up behind my wall. You just don't like the way I use my property. I looked at the camper, the 2 trailers, the stacks of storage bins, and the fresh excavation beside the broken wall. What I like has nothing to do with it. Sure it does. No. The question is whether you damaged my wall and built on my land. Blaine pointed toward the rubble. That wall was always the problem. Then you should have gotten a survey before you brought machines beside it. He said nothing. That was the part he hated most. He could call me difficult. He could say I was overreacting. He could accuse me of being hostile. But he could not explain why he had expanded a hardscape project toward a boundary wall without confirming where that boundary actually was. The next morning, I emailed the HOA. I did not demand fines or punishment. I told them there had been an active construction incident involving a collapsed retaining wall, possible drainage damage, and a pending boundary survey. I attached photographs and asked whether Blaine's approved exterior improvement request included the full paver extension visible along the side of his lot. 3 days passed before I received a response. It came from the architectural review chair, a woman named Heather Solomon. Her email was polite but careful. The HOA had approved a side yard hardscape improvement based on a sketch Blaine submitted the prior spring. The sketch showed a paver expansion approximately 3 feet wider than the original driveway edge. However, she wrote, the HOA's architectural approval did not verify property lines, drainage compliance, county permits, or legal rights relating to adjacent property. That sentence mattered. It meant Blaine could not hide behind the HOA if the pavers crossed the boundary. The approval simply meant the board did not object to the appearance of the project. It did not mean they had authorized him to build on my land. I asked Heather whether the sketch was available. She sent it that afternoon. When I opened the attachment, I understood why Blaine had been so confident. The drawing was crude. It looked like it had been made on a home computer. A rectangle represented his house. Another rectangle represented the camper pad. The property line was a thin dashed line running near the far edge of the pavers. But there was no scale, no survey reference, no dimensions from a known boundary, and no mention of the retaining wall, drainage pipe, or the maintenance strip behind it. It was not a fraudulent document in the criminal sense. It was just vague enough to avoid saying exactly where the work would end. But the final construction had gone much farther than the sketch suggested. I printed the HOA drawing and placed it beside the old recorded plat on my dining room table. The difference was obvious. The plat had measurements. The HOA sketch had assumptions. 2 days before the survey appointment, I noticed a new problem. Rainwater had begun seeping through the collapsed section of wall and pooling beneath the lower corner of my garage foundation. It was not a flood. Not yet. But the ground was saturated, and the missing wall section had left the drainage layer exposed. I called the masonry company that had repaired the wall years earlier. The owner, a man named Arthur Dean, came out the next afternoon. He walked the damaged area with a flashlight and a level. The wall needs temporary stabilization, he said. If we get another hard rain, you could lose more soil along this section. Can you repair it now? Not permanently until the survey is complete. We don't want to rebuild on a line that's still in dispute, but I can install a temporary soil barrier and cover the exposed drainage material. That was exactly what I needed. Arthur photographed everything before he touched the site. He measured the collapsed area, documented the broken stone blocks, and made notes about the drainage fabric. Then he pointed toward the upper edge of Blaine's pavers. Did they excavate beside this wall? Yes. Any idea how deep? No. He studied the soil. The base behind this wall has been disturbed. I can see where gravel was removed or shifted near the drainage layer. Could that have caused the collapse? It could have contributed. But I would need to see the excavation area and the original wall structure to give an opinion. The skid steer impact clearly did damage. The question is whether they also removed support from the other side. That was another fact I wrote down. Not as an accusation. As a question that needed an answer. Arthur installed the temporary barrier and covered the exposed section before the next rain came through. I paid him $180 for the emergency stabilization. That evening, I sent Blaine the invoice and a short message. The wall has been temporarily stabilized due to drainage and soil loss risk. This is not the final repair cost. Please preserve all records relating to your excavation. Pavé installation. And work near the wall. His reply came 20 minutes later. You are spending money on a wall that may not even be yours. I read it twice. Then I saved it. There was no point replying. Blaine had made his position clear. He was not concerned about the soil washing toward my garage. He was not concerned about whether the wall was safe. He was waiting for the survey because he believed it would give him permission to keep the land he had already used. The survey crew arrived the following Wednesday at 8:00 the morning. Renee came with another surveyor named Carlos. They wore bright vests, carried tripods, measuring rods, metal detectors, and a case full of equipment I could not identify. They did not begin at the wall. That surprised Blaine. He came outside almost immediately, holding a mug of coffee and watching them from his driveway. "You're looking in the wrong place," he called out. "The pin is over there." Renee looked toward him. "We start from established control points and recorded monuments," she said. "We do not begin with the marker one homeowner wants to be correct." Blaine's face tightened. Carlos worked near the front corner of my lot for nearly an hour. Then he moved toward the rear greenbelt and located another capped rebar monument beneath a layer of old mulch. Renee checked the measurements against the plat. Only after they had connected those points did they move toward the damaged wall. The rusted pin that Blaine had been so excited about was not the lot corner. It was an old construction reference pin. It had been placed during original grading work more than 20 years earlier and sat nearly 3 feet inside my lot. Renee explained that the pin had no surveyor's cap, no recorded tie, and did not match the control measurements. Blaine looked confused. "So where's the actual line?" he asked. Carlos placed a small flag at the front reference point, then another flag near the rear. A bright orange string was stretched between them. The line did not run beyond my wall. It ran behind Blaine's paver extension. Not by inches, by several feet. Renee walked the string slowly, checking it against the electronic measurements. At the widest point near the collapsed wall, Blaine's paver base crossed onto my property by 4 feet and 7 inches. Closer to the rear, the encroachment narrowed to 3 feet. Near the front, where he had widened the camper pad, a corner of compacted gravel crossed the line by just over 2 feet. But the most serious problem was not the gravel. It was what sat beneath it. The excavation trench for Blaine's drainage pipe and paver base had cut into the maintenance strip behind my retaining wall. The contractor had not simply placed pavers too close to the line. They had disturbed the soil and drainage area inside my property. Renee could not determine fault for the wall collapse. That was outside her role. But she could document location. And location was enough to change the entire dispute. Blaine stared at the orange string as if it had personally betrayed him. "That can't be right," he said. Renee did not react. "The boundary is based on the recorded plat and verified control points. My fence line is farther over." "You do not have a fence line?" "The wall has always been farther over. The wall is inside Mr. Hale's lot," she said. "The survey places the wall approximately 18 to 22 inches inside his boundary along most of this section." Blaine pointed at his pavers. "You're telling me all that is on his land?" "I am telling you that portions of the hardscape and excavation extend across the boundary line." He looked at me. "You paid them to say that?" Renee closed her field book. "My company was hired to survey the boundary. The recorded plat existed before either of you owned these homes." I said nothing. I did not need to. The orange string said everything. For nearly 9 months, Blaine had been parking a camper, trailers, and storage equipment partly on my property. And when he tried to make that space even wider, his machinery had damaged the wall that marked the edge of the land he had been taking. But the survey was only the beginning. Because now I needed to decide what I wanted restored, what I wanted removed, and how to make sure Blaine could not bury the truth under a new layer of gravel. I asked Renee one question before she packed up her equipment. "What do I do now?" She answered without hesitation. "Get the completed survey. Send written notice. Give him a reasonable deadline to respond. And do not allow anyone to remove, rebuild, Or cover the encroachment until you have an agreement in writing. What about the collapsed wall? Your contractor can stabilize it. But before permanent repair, you need to know whether the excavation on the other side affected its support. A civil engineer or qualified wall contractor may need to review that. Blaine heard every word. He stood near the orange string, staring at the pavers that had been part of his driveway extension for nearly a year. Then he looked at me. You knew this was coming. No, I didn't. You've been waiting to take that pad from me. It was never yours to begin with. That's not what I mean. I know. He walked over to the pavers and kicked at the edge with the toe of his boot. You're really going to make me tear this out? I'm going to ask you to remove everything from my property and repair the damage to my wall. You could let it stay. Nobody would even notice. I noticed when your skid steer knocked down my wall. That wall could have fallen on its own. The survey did not make your machine hit it. You don't know that it hit it? Your contractor was standing there. Blaine glanced toward Trent's trailer. Trent had spent the survey day sitting inside his truck, avoiding the argument. I looked at Blaine one last time. You had an opportunity to check the line before you built. You had another opportunity when I warned you about the drainage. Then you had a third opportunity after the wall came down. You chose to tell me it might be your land. He said nothing. So I went inside. 3 days later, Parker Land and Boundary delivered the completed survey. It was not dramatic. It was a professional document with measurements, sealed pages, coordinates, reference points, and a precise drawing of the boundary. The survey marked the encroachment in red. Blaine's paver extension and compacted gravel base occupied approximately 287 square feet of my property. His drainage trench crossed the line for almost 38 feet, and the excavation had entered the maintenance area behind my retaining wall at its deepest point by 19 inches. I placed the survey beside the old site plan and Arthur's stabilization report. The story was clear. My wall had been built inside my lot. The drainage strip behind it was mine. Blaine's contractor had extended the pavers past the actual boundary, excavated into the drainage strip, and then struck the wall while trying to make the widened area larger. The next step was not difficult. It was simply formal. I sent Blaine a certified letter with a copy of the survey, Arthur's invoice, and photographs of the wall before and after the collapse. The letter gave him 14 days to respond. I offered 2 reasonable paths. He could hire a qualified contractor to remove the encroaching pavers, gravel base, and drainage trench from my property, then work with me on a written plan for restoring the wall and drainage system. Or he could provide his homeowner's liability insurance information so the wall damage could be reviewed through the claims process. I did not demand that he pay a number I had not yet documented. I did not threaten to sue him in the letter. I simply stated that if he ignored the encroachment and the damaged wall, I would use the survey and contractor documentation to pursue the available HOA, county, insurance, and civil processes. Blaine signed for the letter 2 days later. He did not respond. On day 10, I received an email from a lawyer. The message was short. The attorney represented Blaine regarding a potential property line dispute. The email claimed Blaine had relied in good faith on existing yard conditions and HOA approval when installing the hardscape. It suggested that the wall location had created ambiguity about the boundary, but the email did not deny the survey. It did not claim Blaine had an easement. It did not state that he owned the disputed strip, and it did not explain why his contractor had excavated into the drainage area behind my wall. I forwarded it to Renee. Her reply was brief. Existing improvements do not alter a recorded boundary. The survey identifies the legal line based on the plat and verified monuments. If the other party disputes it, they may commission an independent licensed survey. That was fair. Blaine had every right to hire another surveyor. He just did not have the right to declare the boundary wrong because he disliked where it landed. Meanwhile, I started checking the county records. At first, I only wanted to know whether Blaine had pulled a permit for the paver extension and drainage work. Some exterior pavers did not require one in our county. But excavation near a drainage swale, changes in runoff, and alterations involving retaining structures could. The county's online portal showed a permit for Blaine's original patio cover. It showed no permit for the side yard extension, drainage trench, or camper pad. That alone did not prove he needed one. So I did not assume. I submitted a complaint to the county building and site development office with the survey, photographs, and a request for an inspection of the altered drainage area. I explained that a retaining wall had collapsed after nearby excavation, and that part of the work now appeared to be across the property line. The county did not come that afternoon. They did not appear the next morning. It took 8 business days. That was exactly the kind of delay people complain about when they want a fast answer. But by then, I had learned that documentation mattered more than speed. A rushed process could be dismissed. A careful one was harder to ignore. The inspector, a man named Victor Haynes, arrived on a Tuesday morning. He did not care about Blaine's personality. He did not care about my frustration. He cared about grade changes, drainage, surface coverage, setbacks, and whether the work matched the county's requirements. Victor reviewed the survey first. Then he walked the paver extension. He measured the distance from Blaine's house to the boundary line. He inspected the surface slope. He looked at the drainage trench. He checked the collapsed wall and the temporary stabilization barrier. After nearly an hour, he called Blaine outside. "Did you install this work yourself?" Victor asked. "No, I hired a contractor." "Do you have a permit record for the drainage modification?" "I didn't know I needed one." "I'm asking whether you have one." "No." Victor pointed toward the paver extension. "Did you verify the property line before construction?" "I had HOA approval." "That is not a boundary verification." Blaine tried the same argument he had used with me. "The wall has always been in the wrong place." Victor looked at the survey. "The wall is not the issue. The recorded property line is the issue." Then he pointed to the slope near the damaged section. "This surface appears to direct runoff toward the retaining wall area. The excavation may also have reduced the drainage zone behind it. I cannot determine the cause of the collapse today, but I can see there has been unpermitted site work." Blaine's face went pale. Victor issued a notice of violation. The notice required Blaine to stop all work near the boundary. He had 30 days to submit either a permitted correction plan or documentation from a licensed engineer showing that the drainage and retaining conditions complied with county requirements. He also had to address the encroachment shown on the survey, because the work could not remain across another owner's property without a recorded agreement. There was no such agreement. There never had been. Blaine received a separate HOA notice that same week. The board had reviewed the survey and the county violation. Their approval of the original hardscape project was suspended because the constructed work differed materially from the sketch he had submitted. The HOA gave him 30 days to submit a corrective plan and warned that daily fines could begin if he ignored the county order or continued using the encroaching area for trailer and camper storage. That was when Blaine finally called me. His voice was different than before. Not apologetic, but smaller. "My lawyer says we should talk." "I'm willing to talk." "Can you meet me tomorrow?" "Yes." We met at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood. I brought the survey, the county notice, Arthur's stabilization invoice, and the letter I had sent. Blaine arrived without Kara. He looked exhausted. For the first time, he did not start by accusing me of making trouble. He sat down and said, "I didn't know that much of the pad crossed the line." "I believe you didn't know the exact amount," I said. "But you knew you had not surveyed it." He rubbed his forehead. Trent told me the wall looked like the line. The wall was inside my property. I know that now. And he excavated behind it. He says he only took out loose soil. Arthur found the drainage layer disturbed. Blaine looked down. I can't afford to rip all of that out and rebuild the wall at the same time. That is why you should contact your insurance company. They already sent someone. Then let them do their job. He looked at me. Can't we just sign something? I pay you for the strip. No. Why not? Because I don't want to sell that strip. It's 4 feet of dirt. It is the drainage space behind my retaining wall. If I sell it, the wall is still mine. But the land needed to maintain it becomes yours. That creates a permanent problem for both houses. He leaned back. You really thought this through? No. I had 11 years of records. That is different. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. Then he stopped. What do you want? I want the encroachment removed. I want the drainage area restored. I want the wall repaired by qualified contractors after the engineer reviews it. And I want all of it documented. That's going to cost a fortune. I know. He gave a bitter laugh. You don't sound happy about it. I'm not. And I meant that. There was no satisfaction in watching a neighbor realize he had made a mess he could not afford to ignore. I would have preferred a normal conversation at the beginning. I would have preferred that he take my first warning seriously. But he had chosen pride over a survey. Then he chose denial over repair. And after that, the process had become bigger than either of us. Blaine's insurance carrier arranged for an engineering review. The engineer inspected the wall, the soil, the drainage pipe, and the excavation area. His report did not say the paver extension alone caused the collapse. That would have been too simple. Instead, it said the wall had suffered an impact, consistent with construction equipment, and that the altered grade, disturbed drainage layer, and excavation behind the wall had increased the risk of soil loss and movement. That was enough. The carrier accepted a restoration plan. Blaine had to pay his deductible. The county required a correction permit. The HOA required a revised architectural submission. And the contractor, Trent, agreed to remove the encroaching pavers and gravel base as part of a settlement with Blaine, after realizing the original layout had never been surveyed. The work took 6 weeks. First, the camper and trailers were moved off the side pad. Then a crew cut and removed the pavers, crossing onto my property. They hauled away the compacted gravel base, exposed the drainage trench, and restored the 18-inch maintenance strip behind my wall. The old pipe was replaced. New drainage fabric and clean gravel were installed. Arthur's masonry crew rebuilt the collapsed section using as many of the original limestone blocks as they could salvage. The blocks that had cracked or fractured were replaced with matching stone. They rebuilt the base, installed new drainage protection, and set the wall just inside the surveyed boundary line. I paid for nothing, beyond a small camera upgrade afterward. The documented wall repair, temporary stabilization, drainage restoration, engineering review, paver removal, permit costs, and landscape replacement came to $27. $460. Most of it was handled through Blaine's insurance and his agreement with Trent. The rest came from Blaine. I did not know what he paid in legal fees, policy increases, or business losses, while the camper and trailers had to be stored elsewhere. I did not ask. I only knew that the expansion he thought would give him more space ended up costing him far more than a survey would have cost before the first shovel went into the ground. By late fall, the side yard looked almost the way it had before. The wall stood straight. The drainage outlet was clear. The new grass had started to fill in along the repaired soil, and bright survey caps marked the property line at the front and rear corners. where nobody could pretend not to see it again. Blaine still lived next door. We were not friends. But he stopped parking anything near the line. He stopped making comments about the wall. And when he eventually built a smaller storage canopy on the part of his lot that actually belonged to him, he hired a surveyor before the contractor arrived. That was all I ever wanted. Not to punish him. Not to embarrass him. Just for him to understand that my land was not an extra room for his plans. The broken wall looked like a disaster the day it came down. But once the dirt was cleared away, it exposed something more important than a rusted marker. It exposed the truth. Blaine had not built too close because my wall was in his way. He had built too far because he assumed nobody would check. If a neighbor damaged your wall and a survey revealed they had been using part of your land, would you insist on removal or consider a written agreement if they offered to pay? Leave your opinion below. And subscribe to HOA Reality Stories for more evidence-based property disputes and neighborhood justice. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life property and HOA themes. Names, characters, location, and specific events have been changed. Visuals may be generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only.